Hello, my name is Alexandre Apsan Frediani, and I'm a principal researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development. I'm also a board member of Habitat International Coalition, representing European members. Thank you for the invitation to talk here today. Yes, we are in a global housing crisis. 2.8 billion people are affected by some form of housing inadequacy, who lack access to adequate housing, more than 1.1 billion of whom live in informal settlements. Yet, despite housing deprivation affecting 1 in 3 of us, we seem to live under what the president of Habitat International Coalition, Adriana Allen, called social anesthesia. As a society, we witness constant housing discrimination and deprivation with no surprise, even labeling the majority of people experiencing exclusion and violence as minorities. It is time to recognize the housing crisis as a human rights crisis, which directly affects whether a fulfilling life is in reach for billions of people. This lack of urgency has seen progress towards the Urban Sustainable Development Goal stagnate, specifically on the critical target 11.1, which states that by 2030, we should ensure access for all to adequate, safe, affordable housing and basic service and upgrade slums. According to the latest UN Synthesis report on SDG 11, the number of people living in informal settlements is growing. The proportion of urban residents in inadequate housing continues to increase, and children remain highly marginalized, significantly compromising the future of a large share of urban population. This global housing crisis is a human rights crisis, and it affects the various dimensions of housing rights recognized by international human rights frameworks, such as security of tenure, availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. While the factors driving the housing crisis are complex, it is crucial to understand the current situation as largely sustained by a housing system that is not responding to the needs of the global majority. Around the world, practice and policy framings usually ignore the true nature of housing deprivation, shaped instead by flawed assumptions about most people's experience of the crisis. This fundamental problem is reinforced by weaknesses in the multilateral system, which has failed to effectively promote transformative agendas to realize housing needs and aspirations. In addition, the cumulative crises stemming from the climate emergency, violent conflicts, ill health, inequalities, and forced migration reinforce each other in ways that disproportionately affect those living in inadequate housing. This existing perverse housing system feeds cycles of marginalization that intersect with inequalities in gender, race, ethnicity, class, and ability, among others. It continues to trap people and places into unsustainable and uneven development pathways. It is clear that we desperately need new ways to talk about housing policy and practice that reflect and respond to real experiences of the world's majority. I would like to start by sharing some data that demonstrate emphatically how access to adequate housing plays a role in the advancement of human flourishment. Then I would like to share a housing justice agenda that has been increasingly being developed through ongoing dialogues and engagements between networks of civil society, academics, and local and regional governments. My key takeaway from those dialogues is a growing agreement that we cannot continue to provide purely technical and discrete solutions to this crisis. I feel a growing demand for a more disruptive and transformative agenda to change the current housing systems, calling for profound political shifts combined with more nuanced vocabularies and broad societal alliances based on values of care, as well as social and climate justice. Recently, I was part of a team conducting a research on the social and economic returns of improving access to adequate housing in informal settlements. In that research, we were particularly interested in the returns in terms of expansion of human development, which can be defined based on dimensions of health, education, and living standards. In this research, we did a detailed literature review to identify existing studies have been looking at relationship between the different dimensions of adequate housing and its impact on the dimensions of human development. It was shocking to see the range of available evidence on this. In terms of health, for example, various studies established the links between overcrowding and ill health, especially of children. We found a powerful study from India linking lack of access to piped water and diarrhea. From Mexico, we found studies linking lack of concrete floors and various forms of diseases and cognitive development. From Nigeria, we identified a powerful study linking mortality ratio of children with lack of habitability, and so on. In terms of education, from Namibia, the lack of access to services and security of tenure have been identified as one of the key impediments for learning. From Argentina, overcrowding has been linked to higher dropout rates, and in South Africa, overcrowding was connected to poor literacy results. From Taiwan, we found a study linking tenure security with children's educational achievements. And across the board, better access to services have impacted particularly girls, as not having to collect water end up improving their school attendance, and so on. In terms of income, lack of affordability and habitability is deeply impacting households' disposable income, as people are having to pay for exorbitant rents as well as housing improvements. At the same time, evidence shows how lack of security of tenure and relocation disrupts livelihoods opportunities, reproducing poverty traps. By drawing on this evidence, we were able to carry out a modeling exercise which allowed us to make some overall conclusions. If housing in informal settlements are improved at scale, countries can see up to the following direct human development returns. As much as 10.5% economic growth, measured as either gross domestic product or gross national income per capita. Life expectancy could increase up to 4% for countries around the world, adding 2.4 years of life on average. More than 730,000 preventable deaths could be avoided annually, a number that is higher than eradicating malaria globally. The expected years of schooling in some countries would increase by as much as 28%. Globally, as many as 41.6 million additional children and young people could be enrolled in primary and secondary education. 1 in every 6 child and young people missing education could come back to school if housing in informal settlements is improved. Even with all this vast evidence, we are still seeing lack of urgency and action. Why? Well, existing studies point to a set of trends that are sustaining existing housing inequalities. This includes the financialization and commodification of land, basic services and housing markets, difficulties in establishing healthy financial management and governance systems, limited tools to engage in diverse processes of housing provision and city making, limited regulations and incentives for construction and development industry, and a crisis in care and social protection systems. So where is the space for transformation and change? In a series of dialogues and activities, we see a growing emphasis on local alliances to engage in housing policy and practice from below. This does not mean renouncing the role of national and international actors, but it reinforces the possibilities to trigger disruptions to current housing systems from local and translocal actions. These experiences are outlined in a report produced to the Global Task Force in relation to the review of the progress of the housing target of SDG 11. In this report, we highlighted that local strategies can enhance the recognition of housing rights. And this can be done through the democratization of housing data collection, the monitoring of housing conditions by civil society groups, as well as the monitoring of housing rights violations, such as evictions and violations of rights of tenants. In the report, we included, for example, the Know Your City initiative in Lagos, in Nigeria, where slum dwellers federations do enumerations and videos about their communities, as well as community-led mapping about risk traps in informal settlements in Lima. We also identified how local actions are protecting housing rights, as governments are responding to evictions, exclusions, and discrimination. We saw, for example, during COVID, on how evictions were put on hold in many cities as well as countries, demonstrating that when there is political will, this can happen at scale. But it can also happen through the establishment and enforcement of regulations of land and housing markets, promotion of more inclusive and responsive forms of land tenure. In the report, we included land use planning tool in Renca in Chile, creating incentives for social housing initiatives, and Community Land Trust Initiative in Puerto Rico, creating community-led mechanisms to manage land and protecting communities against gentrification and market-led displacement. Finally, the report identifies strategies to fulfill the right to adequate housing as local authorities engage in housing provision through public rent and private ownership, as well as by enabling different forms of community-led and co-produced housing. In the report, we included examples of community-led housing and self-management, illustrating how they can create permanent, affordable, and sustainable housing solutions, while also building communities' resilience to address social and environmental shocks. When brought together, we see these practices making meaningful contributions, not only to the urban SDG 11, but also various other sustainable development goals. So, in summary, I see these as an emerging agenda, bringing together housing struggles globally and centering them around the idea of housing justice. I think that this agenda invites us to do 4 things. First, it recognizes the legacy of housing discrimination, and it calls for responses that embraces the politics of reparation. Housing justice also invites us to approach the right to adequate housing as an end, as well as a means for a flourishing life. Housing needs to be prioritized as an infrastructure for sustainable and equitable development. Housing justice invites us to diversify and reimagine what we understand by housing policy, where and when they happen, opening the possibility of paradigm shifts beyond national policies, recognizing a multiplicity of local actors, conditions, needs, aspirations, and capacity to advance the right to adequate housing. And finally, housing justice invites us to promote research and action that address diverse ways of imagining housing futures for all, which I think is one of the objectives of today's event. So I'm looking forward to the conversations and to the next discussions. Thank you.